we've had conversations in committee before about carjacking. The maximum penalty for carjacking someone in Washington is 40 years. Kentucky doesn't even have a carjacking statute. The most you could get someone on would be first-degree robbery, which is 50% of that time. And please, I stand corrected, Mr. Chairman, if I've gotten any of those facts about your state wrong.
No, that's right. We don't have carjacking.
Really? Because I just found a case in March from your state in the neighborhood of St. Denis in Louisville, where there was a serious carjacking.
Lou City.
Oh, actually, that was May. That was this month, May 7th.
If there's a carjacking in Kentucky, it'll be in Louisville, I can assure you.
There's no carjackings outside of Louisville in your state?
I'm sure in the course of history there's been some, but you have one a day in Washington, D.C., sometimes 2 or 3 a day. And with armed robbery, the burglar's going to, there's a lot higher chance if a burglar's going to try to rob someone in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, that they're going to.
So is that an argument to lower the penalties?
Because
That's why they're lower penalties?
merchants, many Kentucky merchants, many Kentucky homeowners practice their right to bear arms, and that's a disincentive for burglars to commit armed robbery in Kentucky versus cities where they have excessive limits on guns. So the gun issue goes both ways. It can also be a detriment to crime.
But in any event, my point, Mr. McGovern, was simply that the people in Washington, D.C., which is, of course, not part of my jurisdiction, but it is under the jurisdiction of the Oversight Committee, the people in Washington, D.C. are taking their crime problem seriously, as I'm sure the people of Louisville are and the rest of Kentucky are. And there's crime all across the country. And apparently what they've been doing in Washington, D.C. has been working, as they've had fairly dramatic reductions in violent crime and in homicide.
18. Let me emphasize D.C.'s current law. Currently, D.C. Code allows a criminal under the age of 25 to be given the same leniency that is afforded to minors. This bill requires that we treat adult criminals as adults. To further address soaring juvenile crime in the district, the bill would require the D.C. Attorney General to create a publicly available website that tracks juvenile crime data. This data will inform Congress, the district's elected officials, the Metropolitan Police Department, the public, and others on the severity of juvenile crime in the city. Finally, the bill prohibits the D.C. Council from amending its sentencing and criminal liability laws, locking in place current D.C. criminal law, and leaving Congress as the sole authority to amend such laws in the future.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. McGovern. The D.C. Crimes Act is the 4th bill the majority has brought to the floor in this Congress to try to overturn laws enacted by the Council of the District of Columbia. It's called the D.C. Criminal Reforms to Immediately Make Everyone Safe Act of 2024, which would be quite a magic trick. This act is even more radical than the other bills that they've brought forward, overturning the legitimately passed laws of Washington, D.C. This one doesn't simply overturn current D.C. law, but it permanently strips Washington, D.C. of its authority over criminal laws generally. This legislation represents the largest rollback of D.C.'s legislative authority to govern itself in nearly 30 years. At a time when the 700,000 tax-paying, draftable citizens of Washington, D.C. are seeking political equality with all other American citizens through the statehood process, this legislation is a serious insult and affront to the people of Washington. Now, it's part of a general effort to attack and undermine and vilify Washington, D.C. Ex-President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over the District of Columbia. Legislation has been introduced to abolish the D.C. government, and the D.C. Crimes Act is part of this campaign to demonize Washington, D.C., its locally elected leadership, and its local laws. Now, my colleagues think that the D.C. Crimes Act shows that they're tough on crime. Far from it, they don't seem to realize that the bill prevents the elected council of the District of Columbia from ever increasing any criminal penalty, including for murder, carjacking, rape, child abuse, you name it. The bill amends the DC Home Rule Act to say that the District of Columbia Council may not, quote, enact any act, resolution, or rule to change any criminal liability sentence in effect on the date of the enactment of the DC Crimes Act of 2024. The bill does not define the term criminal liability sentence, which is not a term of art either in federal criminal law or District of Columbia law. But despite the inartful drafting, the language is clearly intended to prohibit the DC Council from ever changing any statutory criminal penalties. It therefore likely prohibits the DC Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So I don't know whether or not this was a mistake or this was intended, but it clearly prohibits the DC Council from increasing any criminal penalties, which is what the District Council did recently in legislation that was passed by the Council of the District of Columbia. It increased several criminal penalties. That would be now outside of its legislative authority under this act. And it appears to me that it prohibits the DC Council from creating any new criminal laws altogether. So perhaps it's just a messaging bill, and it's just meant to send some kind of ambiguous signal to the people of Washington, D.C., but I don't think it accomplishes what the authors intended to accomplish. And as I said, I think it's an insult to the city where the nation's capital is located. And I will say the chairman mentioned the specific purpose of reversing provisions related to the DC's Youth Rehabilitation Amendment Act of 1985, which allows the courts in DC to use sentencing alternatives for a person who's 24 years old or younger. Some states have similar legislation that set it at 18 or 21. My state is one that sets it at a lower place. South Carolina is one of the states that mirrors DC in giving courts the power to consider youthful offenders at age 24 for differential treatment under their laws. And in South Carolina, someone who is treated that way at 24 or 23 or 22 may be sentenced to no more than 6 years in prison. In DC, they can be treated as a youth at 24, 23, or 22, and they could have an open-ended prison term of 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. And I'm just giving that as one example of a state that has a more permissive and open-ended system than the District of Columbia does. So it's not clear to me exactly why the target here is put on Washington, D.C. In any event, the legislation is written in such a way as to prevent D.C. from increasing statutory penalties or developing new statutory offenses, and this is the kind of ham-handed result we get when we try to pass a messaging bill just to vilify and disparage the people of the nation's capital. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back to you.
Who's the author of this bill?
This is Byron Donald's
All
bill.
right, where's he from? He's from Florida? Mr. Raskin, are you aware that in Florida, adults can be treated as juveniles up to 24?
I believe that's the same rule that D.C. has, and
Right, yeah.
both of those are more liberal rules than we have in Maryland, but we want to leave it up, I think, to each state and local government to decide for itself.
I guess the question is, why does the author of this bill think it's inappropriate for D.C., but it's okay for his home state of Florida?
Well, but I wish my friend Mr. Roy were still here because I really wanted to respond to some of the things that he said that go right to your point. But I do believe that there's an effort here to scapegoat Washington, D.C. I mean, my friend from Texas that seems to be completely unaware of everything that Mayor Bowser in Washington and Chairman Mendelson, the chairman of the council, and the 13-member city council have been doing to fight crime in the city, which is part, of course, of a nationwide wave. And in fact, they've had real practical effect, positive effect. Total crime in D.C. This year is already down 16%. Violent crime is down 25%, and homicide is down 20%. So several months ago, they passed something called the Secure D.C. Act, which would be illegitimate under the legislation that our friends on the GOP side have brought forth today. They increased the criminal penalty for possession of a sawed-off shotgun or a ghost gun. And I know some of them don't like legislation relating to ghost guns, but in D.C., they brought a criminal penalty for it. They increased penalty for possession of a machine gun. Again, I know some people don't like that, but the people in D.C. decided to do it. They increased penalty for repeat sexual abuse. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed in the parks of D.C. and in recreational property. They increased and enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against vulnerable adults, people with a mental disability or older people. They enhanced sentences for crimes of violence committed against rideshare drivers, transit operators, metro rail station managers, and employees and passengers. There's been an epidemic of crime against people who drive buses and metros across the country, and they took action against it. They also created a whole bunch of new offenses for possession of a firearm with intent to sell. Again, I know some of my friends who fashion themselves Second Amendment champions don't like any legislation like they passed in D.C. that criminalizes the selling of firearms. They created a new offense for strangulation. They created a new offense for directing organized retail theft. They created a new offense for possessing a firearm with a removed or altered serial number. They created a new offense for firing bullets in public. They created a new offense for the unlawful discarding of a firearm or ammunition outside of the law. Again, that may or may not be right for Maryland or Kentucky or Minnesota, but that's what they chose in D.C., and they're taking action. And I just think it's an insult and an affront to fellow Americans, albeit unrepresented by voting members in the House and the Senate, to just blindly overturn all of their laws, accuse them of doing nothing, accuse them of not caring about the public safety and public welfare in their own jurisdiction, and then make it impossible for them to create any new offenses. And I'm starting to think maybe it's because so many of their offenses have to do with the problem of gun violence, and maybe that's why they want to essentially legislatively disarm the people in Washington, D.C.
Mr. Raskin, let me get this straight now. So our Republican colleagues portray this bill that is before us as tough on crime. Let me ask you a couple of, I'll make this quick, so yes or no questions. Would this bill that we're dealing with right now, what they call the D.C. Crimes Act, would it permanently prohibit the D.C. Council from increasing the penalties for murder, child sexual abuse, rape, carjacking, and every other crime?
Yes, and my friends have not denied it.
Okay. It strikes me that this bill not only prohibits the D.C. Council from increasing or decreasing criminal penalties, but could be construed to prohibit the D.C. Council from establishing any new crimes at all, since D.C. could not, quote, change any criminal liability sentence. Creating a new criminal penalty could be construed as a change. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree, and you could only create a new crime if it did not have a sentence attached to it.
So you mentioned in March the D.C. Council passed the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act, which increased penalties for, among other things, gun crimes, such as possession of a machine gun and child sexual abuse. It also created new crimes such as strangulation and firing bullets in public. Is it true that this bill, that we're talking about here today, would have prevented the D.C. Council from passing the Secure D.C. Omnibus Amendment Act?
Yes, and it seems like several of their new statutory offenses related to gun crimes and crimes related to gun violence, and that might be part of the motivation in trying to wipe out their legislative authority.
And as you know, this Congress, I think by any measure, is dysfunctional and can only seem to get around to bringing over the finish line must-pass bills. So under this bill, would Congress be the only entity that could increase or decrease statutory penalties in D.C.?
Yes.
Now, former President Trump has repeatedly called for the federal government to take over D.C. And I think my Republican friends like this power game that they play. I mean, they could actually give D.C. more representation in Congress with enhanced voting rights for our delegate, give her the same rights as we all have, and maybe even talk about 2 U.S. senators. But he has talked about taking over the D.C. government. Legislation has been introduced to repeal D.C. Home Rule Act. Home rule has been under greater threat in this Congress than in a generation. Should D.C. residents be worried that a Republican Congress, and God forbid, a Republican president, should they be worried that they could abolish the D.C. government entirely?
Well, that should be among their worries, given the hypothetical you've just offered, yes.
Yeah, and Madam Chair, I mean, Mr. Raskin, when he began, he talked about how the crime rate in D.C. has gone down. Just so that there's no misunderstanding, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the Metropolitan Police Department 2024 year-to-date crime comparison as of today, May 14th, 2024.
Without objection.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Mr. Raskin?
Well, but I would just say this, I think, not just with respect to D.C., but with respect to horizontal federalism generally, I think that we should be cautious about looking at other states and seeing that they punish this or that offense less severely than our own state, and thereby call them soft on crime. In the District of Columbia, for example, there is a maximum penalty for armed robbery of 30 years. In the chairman's home state of Kentucky, it's 20 years for armed robbery. Does that make the people of Kentucky soft on crime? Well, I would reject that. I would say that they are responding to whatever they think the various legislative factors are. For unarmed robbery in D.C., it's 15 years. In Kentucky, it's 10 years. So it's 50% higher for both armed robbery and robbery in the District of Columbia than it is in Kentucky.
So under this bill, basically, I mean, the D.C. Council could not even increase penalties without Congress doing it for them, which I think, and this Congress can't even, pass what the heck for lunch, never mind, serious legislation of any kind. Did you want to add one other thing?
Well, that's what American federalism is about. And the district constituting the seat of government, far from being the colonial plaything of those of us who come from other states, should be accorded the same kind of deference that we accord the other states in terms of them making their judgments. By the way, my staff is finding a whole bunch of carjackings that took place outside of Louisville. There's a town called...
It would be in Louisville. It would be in Louisville. If there are carjackings in Kentucky, they'll be in Louisville.
Do you know of a town called Hebron?
That's the suburb of Cincinnati.
Well, that's not.
Oh, I see. But it's in the state of Kentucky nonetheless, right? It's a suburb of Cincinnati. Okay, well, they found one recently there. It seems like there are some carjackings outside of the border of Louisville, and I'm sure that the people of Louisville would want me to correct that misimpression.
Okay, well, I appreciate your answers to my question. I think this is a joke, quite frankly, that we're doing this. And again, this is par for the course. With that, I yield back.